Well, good. We're going to begin soon. I don't have a voice that colors. Yeah. Okay, will do. All right, good morning, finally. I think I can be heard. Yeah. Okay. All right, we'll try it again. Okay, good. Well, welcome. Thank you for coming on this beautiful morning. I hope you had a good evening and enjoyed yesterday afternoon. Today we have some really fine lectures as well. And I just want to remind you that there are book tables out here. Do not forget to look at those and see if there are any books that you may walk off with at the end of the day. So, our first lecturer this morning is Jordan Ballor, who will be speaking on church, state, and the Swiss Reformation. Jordan earned his doctorate in theology from the University of Zurich and his PhD from Calvin Theological Seminary. He's currently a senior research fellow and the director of publishing at the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. He conducts postdoctoral research in theology and economics at the Free University in Amsterdam as part of the What Good Markets Are Good For project. He's the author of Covenant, Causality, and Law, a study in the theology of Wolfgang Musculus, published in 2012. So we look forward to your lecture this morning.
Well, good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to Corrine and Paul and the Meter Center for arranging this conference. Thank you all for coming out for the conference in general, but also this talk on a Saturday morning on one of the favorite topics that I have to talk about and that we do research on at the Acton Institute, Church and State, and specifically in this context with respect to the Swiss Reformation. Now, in the midst of exile in the Swiss mountains, the Genevan philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau would reflect on the spirit of the Reformation that manifests in his native city 2 centuries earlier. As he navigated the difficulties arising from the censures of both civil and ecclesiastical authorities in his own context, Rousseau offered an interpretation of the Protestant Reformation that bolstered his own cause and cast his project as part of the Reformation's legacy. The spirit of the Reformation, claimed Rousseau, was captured best by what it was against, what it opposed. And the great enemy of the Protestant reformers, of course, was the Roman Catholic Church, and specifically the Church's hierarchy, its magisterium, its inquisition, all of which was personified in the office and person of the Pope. Now, in Rousseau's telling, the individual believer's judgment is set over against the authority of the Roman Church. This is the central dynamic of the Protestant Reformation. The Reformers criticized the teaching of the Roman Church and in its place offered their own interpretations of Scripture. Thus, says Rousseau, the individual mind is established as the sole interpreter of Scripture. Thus, the authority of the Church is rejected. Thus, each is put under his own jurisdiction for doctrine. Such are the 2 fundamental points of the Reform, says Rousseau, to acknowledge the Bible as the rule of one's belief and not to admit any other interpreter of the meaning of the Bible than oneself. Now, for Rousseau, the combination of the spiritual tyranny of the Church and the physical coercion of the state was the great monster that the Protestant Reformation had slain, or at least whose supremacy had been broken, thereby liberating humanity from the shackles of Pope and Emperor. The consequences for a new conception of church and state were clear. There could be no more promotion of orthodoxy through coercive means. At most, the church and state might collaborate to allow room for a great diversity of opinion, while using moral suasion to positively promote a particular understanding of religion. Thus, says Rousseau, the peoples of the Reformation, quote, tolerated, and they ought to tolerate, all interpretations except one, namely that which removes liberty of interpretation. Now, Rousseau's characterization of the Reformation has only been briefly represented here, and his presentation is used does not do justice, perhaps, to the explanatory power and persuasiveness of Rousseau's narrative. In the course of the talk, we'll hopefully have occasion to explore in more detail some of Rousseau's more particular claims, and characterizations. But Rousseau's basic story here is, in fact, a narrative that has been convincing for many, not only in Rousseau's own time, but from the time of the Reformation itself down to the present day. It's an interpretation of the Reformation that has found agreement on its basic dynamics from both proponents as well as opponents of the Protestant Reformation. It is, in its essence, a totalizing or absolutizing interpretation of the Protestant Reformation in its various manifestations. That is, the Protestant Reformation is fundamentally characterized as the total or absolute inversion of the Roman Catholic Church. In place of the Pope, we might say, the individual person has been enthroned. Again, as Rousseau puts it, quote, the individual mind is established as the sole interpreter of Scripture. And this is an establishment with significant implications for the social establishments of religion and civil government. An alternative to this kind of totalizing or absolutizing characterization of the Protestant Reformation vis-a-vis Roman Catholicism, and indeed the medieval period more generally, is what we might call a textual and contextual approach. This method of interpreting history focuses on the continuities as well as the discontinuities in any historical period or with respect to any historical phenomenon. It pays attention to ideas as well as actions, the causal dynamics of both individual agents as well as social institutions, structures, and impersonal forces. This approach does not result in a uniformity of historical interpretations, of course. In fact, it opens up space for a great diversity of understandings as the relative merits and significance of different bits of evidence and shades of textual interpretation are explored. A fine exemplar of this approach is the work of Richard Muller, particularly his 4-volume post-Reformation Reformed Dogmatics, but through the rest of his work as well. Here the focus is on both historical continuities and discontinuities as they're inflected by different genre, circumstances, contexts, controversies, and intellectual and theological developments. As he put it in an earlier work, excuse me, the theology of the Protestant Reformation should not be primarily seen as an Archimedean point in history. In fact, writes Muller, quote, it's worth recognizing from the outset that the Reformation altered comparatively few of the major loci of theology. The doctrines of justification, the sacraments, and the church received the greatest emphasis, while the doctrines of God, the Trinity, creation, providence, predestination, and the last things were taken over by the magisterial Reformation virtually without alteration. These magisterial reformers, says Muller, quote, were intent upon distancing themselves and their theology from problematic elements in medieval thought, and at the same time remaining Catholic in the broadest sense of that term. So whereas we might understand a narrative like that offered by Rousseau as totalizing, absolutizing, or even revolutionary, we can understand a characterization as offered by Muller, for instance, as one of reform rather than revolution. Now, the implications of these more general methodological points for our exploration here today include the recognition that we ought to try to understand how the Protestant reformers, and particularly here the Reformed theologians in Switzerland in the 16th century, understood themselves and the coherence of their own views on church and state before we might even try to attempt to transcend this self-understanding from the perspective of history. Now, this attention to the texts and the contexts of church and state in the Swiss Reformation will proceed in the following way. First, I will briefly highlight some relevant medieval and proximate backgrounds concerning church and state. This is highly selective. There are 2 things that I really want to talk about to set it up. Next, we will see how the frameworks arising out of these contexts manifests in a particular paradigm or typology of church and state in the Swiss Reformation. Then we will see how the official teachings of the Swiss Reformation, as articulated particularly in the confessional documents arising from the period, map onto this church-state paradigm. And finally, before a brief conclusion, we'll add some complexity or nuance to the basic typology by examining the salience of a particular tool or feature of church discipline, and that is excommunication, and how the teaching related to it helps us to come to a deeper understanding of the dynamics of church and state in the Swiss Reformation and the Reformations of Europe more broadly. Now, there are 2 basic elements of background I want to establish, as I've said, before proceeding to discuss the dynamics of church and state in the Swiss Reformation more directly. The first has to do with the broader and more distant medieval background. And the second has to do with the more proximate developments in the early days of the Reformation, particularly concerning Martin Luther. With respect to the broader medieval background, it is simplistic, but perhaps not misleadingly so, to describe the basic features of the relationship between church and state in the Middle Ages as the contest between pope and emperor for supremacy. Arising from the fall of the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire continued as an aspiration, if not always a concrete reality, for Christian Europe. There was a real sense of the fundamental unity of society. This unity has been described with various terms with somewhat different shades of meaning and usefulness: Constantinianism, Christendom, or the Latin formula Corpus Christianum. This latter phrase perhaps best captures the elements in play, as the Christian body of society was understood in some meaningful way to be a coherent organism, with both physical as well as social and spiritual dimensions. But just as a properly formed human body needs each of the organs and limbs and systems in the right places and functioning properly, a unified and healthy society needs its various elements to cohere together properly and relate appropriately to the leading principle or power. So perhaps most importantly, a body needs a head. And the struggle related to church and state in the medieval period had to do with whether the Pope, and more broadly the church and hierarchy, was the leading authority in Christian society, or whether it was the emperor and temporal authority who held primacy. A high point of pontifical claims to supremacy in this period is seen in the papal bull Unum Sanctum of 1302, in which Pope Boniface VIII concludes that, quote, "It is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff." Other theories and claims, competing ones, existed as well, notably in the views of Boniface's contemporary Marsilius of Padua. So the more distant background for our discussion of church and state in the Swiss Reformation is this broader medieval striving between the temporal and spiritual powers for primacy, with all the ebbs and flows and vagaries of a millennium of that history. Now, the more proximate context is the fundamental breakdown of these two authorities as plausible leaders of a unified Holy Roman Empire, and still less a Christian Europe. Otto von Guericke describes the decline of imperial prestige through the early modern period in this way: "It was as but a lifeless phantom that the imperium mundi," that is the worldly or claims to worldly or universal authority, "was dragged along by the imperialistic publicists. It was as but a lifeless phantom." But at the same time, the power of the papacy was also constrained by recalcitrant lesser authorities. As the legal historian Harold Berman puts it, at the turn of the 16th century, quote, "Everywhere in Europe, royal power over the feudal nobility was increasing, secular authority was asserting itself against ecclesiastical authority, and territorial loyalties were intensifying. Everywhere in Europe, strong voices were advocating reduction of ecclesiastical power and reformation of both church and state. Everywhere, the cities were seeking greater autonomy." It's in this context that Luther originally seeks to enlist the secular powers to initiate the necessary ecclesiastical reforms from his point of view. Now, it's notable that Luther originally implores the emperor to take up the historical imperial role as ecclesiastical reformer, but only after exhausting avenues for reform from within the church. Thus writes Berman, quote, "At first, Luther hoped that the Roman Catholic hierarchy itself would accept his new teaching. His first appeal was in effect to the Pope himself. When he found no support from Rome, he turned to the emperor and to the imperial nobility for help. In this, too, he was unsuccessful. When the emperor outlawed him, his own prince protected him, but did not endorse his views. From Luther's perspectives, the authorities of Pope and Emperor had failed to undertake the necessary reforms. But at the same time, they also failed to be able to prevent the reform efforts that he would pursue in Wittenberg, and that various figures, including notably Zwingli and Zurich, and others would pursue in different contexts. If Pope and Emperor were unwilling to undertake the necessary reforms, then at least they could not unilaterally prevent such reforms from being pursued by more local authorities in places like Wittenberg, Zurich, Geneva, and elsewhere. With this more distant medieval and more proximate early Reformation context in place, it's now time to turn to a closer examination of different models of the relationship between church and state that were in place in the 16th century. There are two basic models with various subtypes. We'll spend most of our time here focusing on those two major categories, with a bit more on a couple of the subtypes of one of the categories in a minute. And we're going to take our point of departure in the framework offered by a theologian that has not been mentioned yet by a speaker except for Paul's introduction, Wolfgang Musculus. His dates are up there. He spent time in Strasbourg and Augsburg before briefly spending some time in Zurich and ending his career in Bern. Now, in his Locus on the Civil Magistrate, written during his time in Bern, Musculus identifies the office of the magistrate as a, quote, ministry of justice, in contrast with the ministry of grace fulfilled by the pastors of the church. Only the civil magistrates can legitimately bear the sword, and one of the purposes of this administration of temporal justice and punishment is to promote and protect godliness and righteousness in society. And it's here that Musculus distinguishes the two basic approaches to the relationship between church and state, or between ecclesiastical and civil authorities in his own day. The first view, up here on the left, privileges the interiority of religion, piety, and true faith. Faith, understood as an internal and spiritual reality, cannot be coerced by external means. Therefore, the civil authorities have no justification for using the power of the sword to induce or enforce adherence to a particular understanding of true religion. Musculus identifies this view historically with the church father Tertullian, who, according to Musculus, argues that, quote, it is not any part of religion to compel and enforce religion, which ought to be undertaken of one's own accord and not by violence. This is the first view. The second view, says Musculus, is the one which he favors, and which holds instead that the civil magistrate does have a duty to protect and promote true religion and worship of God. This view, says Musculus, is shared by all Christian magistrates, evangelicals as well as Roman Catholics. The responsibility of the magistrate on this view, says Musculus, is not to allow it to be lawful for anyone, quote, to swerve from the true and lawful religion of God, nor to follow any false doctrine or cause others to follow such false teaching. If the first view is the minority view or the minority report within church history, this view is the dominant view, at least by Musculus' own time. It's a core conviction, he claims, shared by both Roman Catholics as well as the magisterial Protestants, Lutheran and Reformed. Now, Musculus' basic distinction here between approaches to the care of religion and society and the responsibilities of the civil magistrate map neatly onto the paradigm provided by the historian Robert Louis Wilkin, and the one that he uses to explore what he calls the Christian roots of religious liberty. The one model, which he traces to the protocols of Milan and Lactantius, and Tertullian more distantly, is that which, quote, allowed all citizens to practice the form of piety each deemed best. The second model, which was the dominant model of Christendom of the Middle Ages, is the view proposed by Musculus and attributed, again, to the Reformers as well as to the Roman Catholics. In Musculus' own time, there were, of course, Anabaptists and radical reformers, as we heard last night especially, who made very similar arguments regarding the interiority and non-coercibility of faith, just as there had been others in the Middle Ages who resisted this dominant model of Christendom. An exceptional example in the Swiss context is one of Calvin's tormentors, to use Gary Jenkins' phrase, Sebastian Castellio. Castellio clashed with Calvin over the execution of Servetus, as well as the role of the external and civil discipline in ordering society and promoting true doctrine. For Castellio, the use of sanctions to punish heresy and apostasy not only fails to promote true religion, it actually impedes it. Pointing to the examples of Zwingli and Charles V, Castellio argues that when they pursued reform by spiritual means, they succeeded, and he says this specifically about Zwingli. But when they resorted to coercion and arms, they failed. It seems that the God of armies, says Castellio, clearly shows through such examples that he does not want these aims to be achieved through violence. When you force someone to profess outward faith in something they don't believe internally, argues Castellio, you create hypocrisy and the desire for revenge. Now, a final word on this claim by Castellio before we move on. Castellio's observation regarding the fomenting of hypocrisy by the use of external means of coercion and conformity seems self-evident and manifestly true. Now, it isn't the case, however, that the advocates of the second view, that is the view that Musculus upholds, the use of the defense of the use of civil and coercive means to promote and protect true religion, do not recognize this danger. They absolutely do recognize it. They do realize that hypocrisy will be an inevitable byproduct of their program. for the care of religion. But recognizing and acknowledging this danger, the danger of hypocrisy, is only part of the relevant calculus. The other element, which in their view weighs much more heavily, is the danger of what we might call evangelical apostasy, the kind of heretical teaching and belief that not only is an error, but leads others into error. So we might say that for the advocates of the civil magistrate's care of religion, the second view, the analysis goes something like this. Now, it's true that the hypocrite does not have true faith and may well be damned for their unbelief, but they do not, at least insofar as they adhere externally to acceptable behavior, lead others into the danger of damnation as well. The hypocrite only damns himself or herself. The missionary apostate can cause others to fall, endangering their eternal destiny, as well as undermining social stability and thus endangering temporal prosperity as well. Now, we've seen that under Musculus's typology, the evangelicals, meaning the Reformed as well as the Lutherans, do not differ with the Roman Catholics about the fundamental duty of the civil magistrate to protect and promote true religion. Musculus's claim thus belies Rousseau's characterization from the opening of the lecture, that in fact the Reformation's central and most fundamental departure from Rome was precisely at this point. A brief survey of the official confessional documents of the Swiss Reformation will help to settle the issue, however, as it may be that Musculus's claim does not hold up to greater scrutiny. That could just be his own idiosyncratic claim. Now, early confessional documents, whether of a more personal variety or having some official standing, address the responsibilities and office of the civil magistrate. They tend to be more silent about the positive duties of the magistrate towards religion. So Zwingli's 67 articles of 1523, for example, include 10 theses on temporal authority and included are propositions such as, quote, all their laws ought to conform to the divine will, and they alone are entitled to impose the death penalty, and then only on those who give public offense. His short Christian instruction, also of 1523, states that, quote, we are to be obedient by divine command to the government, which carries the sword. However, a government shall command nothing that is against the honor of God and his word. And more generally, says Zwingli, as God has given the sword into the government's hand, it should see to it that it does not fight for the sake of its own profit, but that it punishes the evil with it and protects the good. So a general statement about the viability of the magistrate and its office. Likewise, Zwingli later confesses in the Fidei Ratio of 1530 that, quote, the magistrate is the minister of goodness and justice. In his Fidei Expositio of 1531, Zwingli likens the church and civil government to the soul and body of the human person. Quote, in the Church of Christ, government is just as necessary as preaching, though this latter occupies the first place. For as a man cannot exist except as composed of both body and soul, however much the body is the humbler and lower part, so the church cannot exist without the civil government, though the government attends to and looks after the more material things that have not to do with the spirit. Guillaume Farel's Sommaire of 1529 includes a discussion, quote, concerning the sword and power of justice and corporeal superiority. And here, Farel makes an intriguing distinction between the spiritual and the physical and locates the civil authority's responsibility in the latter, paralleling Zwingli's image in the Fidei Expositio. Farel's main concern is to establish legitimacy of Christians serving as governmental authorities, contra the teaching of the Anabaptists. And that seems to be the basic thrust of some of these early statements about the role of the civil magistrate, simply establishing it as legitimate. Now, faced with the challenges of Anabaptism and more other radical expressions of reform, it's perhaps not surprising that the more positive responsibilities of the civil government with respect to religion become more of a focus as the Reformation progresses and develops. In the case of the Barron Synod of 1532, the conclusion is clear that, quote, it's fitting that the magistrate who desires to maintain a Christian rule and a pious government should diligently apply his authority as God's maidservant, preserving the external aspects of doctrine and life of the gospel among their subjects. The Synod proceeds, however, to distinguish between outward and inward realities and draws the line and attempts to coerce belief or compel conscience, understood as an internal reality. Quote, no magistrate should compel the conscience or command and forbid with respect to anything more than what is outward, lest good consciences should be burdened by the Holy Spirit constrained. Jesus Christ our Lord, to whom God has given all authority and the power of the Holy Spirit, is alone lord of the conscience. So even as the civil magistrate does have a positive duty to promote and protect true religion, the limits of its abilities and responsibilities are acknowledged. Thus, the synod concludes the magistrate should give attention to sound doctrine, ward off error and enticement to evil, remove all blasphemy and open sin in religion and life, and protect truth and honesty, etc. The First Helvetic Confession of 1536, which in some sense now presents a united front for the Reformed cause in Switzerland, argues that, quote, since every magistrate is from God, his principal duty, unless he's to exercise tyranny, is to defend and look after religion by curbing all blasphemy, and just as the prophet teaches from the Word of God, to perform it vigorously. Now, this basic sensibility is echoed in subsequent documents, including Calvin's Catechism of 1537, for example, which teaches that princes and magistrates are, quote, to keep in true purity the public form of religion, to establish and to guide the life of the people by very good laws, and to procure the welfare and tranquility of their subjects both in public and in private. This is echoed again and again. Beza, in his confession in 1560, says that it's for the Christian magistrate to call councils, just as Constantine had done. So too, quote, it belongs to the magistrate that the laws which he uses and executes may be conformable to the will of God, and principally to order that religion be perfect and holy. This is Beza. And that the whole church be ordered according to the word of God, forbidding and punishing as the case requires all those who trouble the church or concerning the discipline of it. Now we'll conclude this brief survey with the Second Helvetic Confession of 1566, the most extensively influential confession of this era in the Swiss context, certainly. The chief duty of the civil magistrate, according to the Second Helvetic Confession, quote, is to procure and maintain peace and public tranquility, which doubtless he shall never do more happily than when he shall be truly seasoned with the fear of God and true religion. Namely, when he shall, after the example of the most holy kings and princes of the people of the Lord, advance the preaching of the truth and the pure and sincere faith, and shall root out lies and all superstition with all impiety and idolatry, and shall defend the church of God. For indeed, we teach, says the confession, that the care of religion chiefly pertains to the holy magistrate. The magistrate is to, quote, draw forth this sword of God against criminals, including blasphemers. He is likewise to, quote, suppress stubborn heretics who cease not to blaspheme the majesty of God and to trouble the church, yes, and finally to destroy it. Now, this brief survey is sufficient, I think, to broadly establish that the Reformed view in Switzerland in this period considers it to be the fundamental task of civil authorities to promote and to protect, that is, to care for true religion. Now, this is not formally speaking a difference with Roman Catholicism. The differences there are not about the role of the civil powers with respect to religion, but rather in what blasphemy, heresy, and so on consists of, what ought to be counted as those things. Now, against Rousseau, then, the magisterial Swiss Reformation does not fundamentally oppose the Roman Catholic view, except insofar as Roman Catholics present the ecclesiastical powers, and especially the Pope, as having primacy over secular and civil powers. This is a key point of Reformation polemic. Now, this point of disagreement, that is regarding the proper relationship between civil and ecclesiastical authorities, can be highlighted to further differentiate and add detail to this basic typology we received from Musculus, in which we've seen, I think, is vindicated by the teachings of the Swiss Reformed confessions. So if we go back to this model, I've added a couple subcategories there under the evangelicals, categories I'll call the disciplinarist and the magistratical subcategories. Now, this further subdistinction within the second view is, as I've said, what we might call the magistratical versus the disciplinarian model of church and state. Now, these are both, again, to reemphasize, subtypes under this broader Christendom or Corpus Christianum model, the second view. And their difference between these two subtypes relates to their relative valuation of the primacy of discipline in ecclesiastical affairs, and particularly, I think, with regard to excommunication. The magistratical view, which Musculus himself favors and is associated with Zurich, tends to downplay the salience of excommunication. even sometimes exempting civil authorities from the possibility of excommunication. This is one of the concrete points in church history that comes up again and again. What is the status of the Christian magistrate with respect to excommunication? Following the theories and historical interpretation of Thomas Erastus, excommunication, even when confessed to be legitimate, is typically seen as a tool of clerical tyranny, unjustly used against Christian princes and magistrates. So earlier, one of the pictures was a 17th century painting of the famous confrontation between Ambrose and Theodosius. And Ambrose is preventing Theodosius from entering until he does proper penance. This painting is from the 17th century, and it's by a Roman Catholic. And it's famous representation of this, and the standard historical account of this is that Ambrose is defending the rights of the church and exercising proper church discipline. Theorists and historians like Erastus, however, blame Ambrose for acting unjustly in this case. So it's an interesting kind of twist on this dynamic, the interpretation of church and state. So this magistratical model argues that since the Christian magistrate or prince has first position in society, as a believer and a member of the church, they also occupy the primary position within the church, and that matters of discipline and punishment are properly under the Christian magistrate's jurisdiction. So when you have a united society like this, and the magistrates are Christians and parts of the church, and they occupy this primary place in society, they are the appropriate authorities to mete out discipline. That's why I call this the magistratical model, because of the priority placed on the role of the Christian magistrate, both in terms of ecclesiastical as well as civil affairs. The other view is that of the disciplinarians or the disciplinarists, which emphasizes the relative sovereignty of the church and its officers within its own institutional integrity and sphere. This view tends to emphasize the significance of church discipline in its various expressions, but including, most notably, excommunication, as the mark of the true church, and the responsibilities of the ecclesiastical officers, independent and apart from the jurisdiction of the civil government, to pursue and enforce such discipline. Now, this model is more often associated with Calvin and Geneva, the company of pastors, and the independent meetings and government of the clergy and the church. This model tended to sharply distinguish between the status of people in the civil realm over against that of the church, favoring a much more egalitarian emphasis within the ecclesiastical realm, although not always radically so, including even the government and organization of the church itself. For example, in the principle of the formal equality of all ordained pastors against a hierarchical or episcopal model. So you could have hierarchy in the civil realm, but that didn't necessarily transfer into judgments about authority and status within the context of the institutional church. This other model is sometimes called a two-sphere model, as opposed to the more unified one-sphere model of the magistratical view of Christian society. Now, I argue that the doctrine and practice of excommunication provides a salient way to understand the development of models in church and state in the Swiss Reformation within this second view, in the second context. In the magistratical model, excommunication is de-emphasized, if not delegitimized. In the disciplinarist model, excommunication presents the highest spiritual power of the church and is a defining feature of church discipline as a mark of the true church. Now, oftentimes, as we've seen already last night, the examples of Anabaptist commitment to liberty of conscience and freedom of belief is understood as a direct and substantive modern antecedent to more modern conceptions of religious liberty. And to some extent, this is true, of course. The suffering of the Anabaptists and other so-called radicals experienced in this period can certainly be seen as a foundation for religious freedom based on the commitment to freedom of conscience, recognizing the validity of some of the claims of that first view with respect to church and state. But as at least some versions of the Anabaptist communities also made extensive use of excommunication or the ban to enforce discipline and maintain order within the Christian community. And so here I want to briefly sketch how a version of what I have called the disciplinarist model of church and state, which practices a form of excommunication, provides the theoretical as well as practical space for toleration, if not more robust conceptions of religious liberty. Now, some versions of excommunication include significant social or civil consequences, as well as those understood as spiritual or relating to ecclesiastical affairs. And this is important, I think, to understand why figures like Erastus would have such a problem with the way excommunication had been practiced. It wasn't just a spiritual act of discipline. It was one that had material, political, and social consequences, and was in fact used as a political tool on this interpretation by popes. So a person who's excommunicated can be, or a city, I suppose, can be punished directly or indirectly in political, economic, and relational terms. So the most extreme example of this might be something like an Anabaptist ban, but it could take other forms as well. An excommunicated person might be estranged from his or her family, or their business might no longer be patronized, or any other number of such possible sanctions within the civil or social sphere. Now, before concluding, I want to highlight the thought of one more theologian's thought regarding excommunication, that of the Italian reformer Peter Martyr Vermigli. And I can make a connection to the Swiss Reformation because he ended his career in Zurich. So, among his many travels, he did die in Zurich. For Vermigli, excommunication is a valid and necessary means of church discipline. And in fact, Vermigli is much more consistent in defending discipline as a mark of the church than some of other notable figures. He is to be numbered, I think, therefore, among the disciplinarists or the disciplinarians. But Vermigli also argues for a more limited civil and social impact for excommunication, at least in some circumstances, favoring the practice's spiritual and ecclesiastical purposes. Thus, writes Vermigli, quote, "If a father or a husband shall be excommunicated, then the wife or children are not for this cause set apart from living with him, and neither be they excommunicated by reason of their conversation with him. Neither is it to be otherwise judged of the buying of merchandise of them that are excommunicated, if that necessities into life cannot otherwise be had. For if all evil men should be avoided in bargains and civil contracts, we should of necessity go forth from the world." So excommunication on the spiritual side is, of course, seen as the most severe penalty or the most severe imposition of church discipline, always with the purpose of bringing the recalcitrant person back into full communion. But it has limitations with respect to what kind of temporal sanctions might be taken or the consequences of it. I think the impacts of this kind of sentiment are significant. It essentially recognizes a common realm of life beyond the Christian church, institutionally speaking, and that governed by the Christian magistrate committed to promoting and protecting true religion. This other realm is what we might call civil society, the area of common meeting, association, trade, and relationship in the world, to use Vermigli's phrase, where excommunication and church discipline more broadly is practiced without particularly severe or formal civil, legal, or social consequences. Space has been opened up both for genuine ecclesiastical discipline as well as for relatively independent civil society. So the legitimacy of this independent or sovereign sphere is acknowledged in Vermigli's admission that to deny it, would require abandoning the world. Now, in conclusion, we've seen that Rousseau claims a fundamental departure from the Roman Catholic Church with respect to the civil establishment and protection of religion as definitive of the Protestant, Swiss, and specifically Genevan Reformation. Our survey of Swiss confessional teachings as cohering with the basic framework articulated by Musculus contradicts this claim, at least as it relates to the self-understanding of the Swiss Reformed themselves. The realities of church and state in the Swiss Reformation are much more complex, however, than can be captured either by a Rousseauian binary between the free individual interpretation of Scripture and the Roman Church's magisterium, or by distinguishing between a Corpus Christianum perspective and that of the minority report of Tertullian, Lactantius, the Protocols of Milan, as well as the later Anabaptists and Sebastian Castellio. Rousseau also claimed that, quote, "those who distinguish civil from theological intolerance," you can think here of Vermigli as I've presented him, "are, to my mind, mistaken. The two forms are inseparable. It is impossible to live at peace with those we regard as damned." Now, Vermigli, at least on my presentation, would differ. And his teaching on excommunication can be seen as a theoretical as well as practical contribution to the development of a distinct sphere of civil society as a field of relationship and activity between church and state. Similarly, the theoretical and doctrinal views of figures like the Jesuit Martinus Bicanus, who argues for the independent viability of contracts apart from confessional identity, attests to a nascent but growing recognition of social life as consisting of more than the institutional and formal jurisdictions of church and state. Today, we are still living in the midst of many of the same dynamics that characterize the debates over church and state in the early modern period and the Swiss Reformation in particular. It remains to be seen whether Rousseau's formulation that only that which is intolerant cannot be tolerated, which I would say is actually a form of what's been called the dictatorship of relativism, if that view is the only alternative to some other form of ecclesiastical or civil tyranny. Thank you.
Thank you. We now have time for questions. So again, please, when you ask your question, state your name and hold the mic at the top. Thank you.
Well, Jordan, thank you very much. That really was wonderful. Johannes Fabry from Constance. I see. Chad Gano from Aquinas. But I wonder, your talk suggests to me maybe that we have our larger narrative wrong in a sense. I mean, the macro narrative of the victory of toleration, in a sense, has tended to, stress the Anabaptist Castellio, and then of course we run forward to 1648, and so there's also the practical side. But within this, this tension that leads to toleration, particularly within the Anglo-American tradition, I guess I'm saying, is this internal debate within the Reformed tradition, do you think has it been wrongly downplayed in the larger narrative?
If the larger narrative is that first narrative that you articulated, I think that's true. And adding this claim regarding Vermigli, for example, and the role of excommunication, this disciplinary model, it doesn't mean to downplay the significance of these other phenomena and figures. I guess the broader narrative should be something like there are many sources for it, and it works out in many different ways depending on the context and how those things are received. So we can think of the reception of these things in the Netherlands, for example. Moving over, say, in an Anglo-American context, this kind of basic view, the view that Musculus says is this shared view, is the one that's instantiated in Reformed confessions, including the Belgian Confession and the Westminster Standards. So once you arrive at a new context, like the American colonies, for example, or something like this, and we have an establishment here that's quite different, you have to reckon with that in some way, right? So, of course, the Westminster Standards are altered in their American context precisely on the teaching with respect to church and state because of this context, in relation to this context at least. In the Netherlands in the 19th century, figures like Herman Bavinck and Abraham Kuyper argue for a revision of Article 36 of the Belgian Confession because we've got a new situation and, to some extent, a new understanding of the legacy of the Reformation with respect to these things. So there's an interesting way in which you could say Kuyper and Rousseau agree in a limited extent about the claims that this dominant view had with respect to the role of the civil authority in promoting true religion in society. Now, they differed on the significance of that and to the extent to which they were wrong and why they were wrong and so on. But there is a kind of an agreement there. And so, we're still grappling, I think, in many ways with the consequences of this in our own context today. So even though we're 500 years removed, I mean, these are some of the fundamental dynamics that characterize tensions in the American context, but also in Europe. I mean, where you've got still in many cases formally established, or at least the church-state situation is different there, has always been different there, and it gives rise to new kinds of challenges as pluralism increases and so on.
This is John Roth. I really appreciate the nuanced approach that you take and agree completely that there are that the emergence of what we have come to understand modern religious liberty has many, many streams feeding into it, and we should be cautious against any sort of grand narrative that simplifies it. I'm wondering, though, in your distinction between the magistratical and the disciplinarist approaches.
I don't really like the disciplinarian model.
You have traced the movement through the confessional literature. I wonder if you've spent any time looking at the mandates themselves coming from the secular side, that's the wrong term, but from the government side, because the mandates, I think you will find a different kind of argument, or I suspect you will find a different kind of argument than what you see in the confessional side. And I think that might be worth at least looking at a little more closely.
Yeah, I have not done that, so thank you. So one thing I'll say is that, and again, rightly so, I think the heroes of conscience, you could say, have been recognized in this narrative about how we've arrived at a kind of a more modern conception of religious liberty. The real challenge is Rousseau's claim puts it in sharp relief. How do you live with people you think are damned without coercing them or killing each other? So it's one thing to withdraw to a certain extent. One model might be to withdraw and not live with those people. So they exist and I'm not going to go to war with them, but I'm not in society with them in some fundamental sense. Where, and I'm putting a lot of weight on this, I understand, with Vermeely, but whereas a distinction between church discipline and civil penalties, where there's still some other sense of a unified society, I think is a more direct antecedent, you could say, or more directly analogous to a kind of situation we have here in the United States today. Yeah, that's all I want to say at that point, I guess.
Thank you, Jordan. Scott Manage from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. On that last point, it might be important to flesh out what you mean by excommunication. Most of the reformers distinguish between suspension from the Lord's table, which would not require social ostracism or exclusion, so these individuals would remain part of the civic, familial, economic life of the community. And then a much more radical step of excommunication, at least in Geneva, which would involve exclusion and ostracism, and was pretty rare, actually. So suspension was by far the more common approach, and yet, as we know, in Geneva, it was also, suspension was also, heartily opposed by the magistracy. So, when you're thinking about Vermigli and how unique he is in terms of positing a form of excommunication that doesn't entail exclusion, is he talking, does he have a kind of more nuanced view of suspension versus excommunication, or is he lumping all those together?
Yeah, at least in that particular context where he's discussing it, I don't think he doesn't articulate a further sanction. But I want to use him more as, I guess, an example than a kind of he's a unique case, right? I will use him as an example that this kind of distinction, I think, is an important antecedent, an important kind of conceptual point to make with regard to, say, this disciplinarist model. But I appreciate your point. That's, it makes me think of, maybe you wouldn't call it excommunication, but expulsion of someone from a city basically accounts to the same thing, right? And so in that sense, places like Zurich, or maybe it was an extreme case, but certainly with respect to the Anabaptists, you kick them out of a city, that's a form of certainly not just ecclesiastical suspension or barring, but you're barring them from civic life. So it's not just that the Anabaptists had a ban in a sense. There's a sense in which these magisterial authorities also had a ban that had maybe a more political primary salience, but also had implications for your understanding of the Christian society. So I appreciate that. I'm raising the issue of excommunication as a thing that I found interesting, and certainly I need to look at more deeply, and I know others have as well, so I need to do more work there. Thank you.
Gordon Starr, this is in a historical context. Would the magistrate be could he overreach to ban same-sex marriage? And the second question is, does the state historically ever have the authority to compel church attendance?
So the first question in the context of the 16th century?
Whatever.
Yeah, I mean, certainly regulation of marriage would be seen as a valid arena for the civil authorities to exercise legislative and coercive power. And the second question was, could the civil authorities overreach? Sorry, was that the second question? Oh, to compel church attendance. I think one understanding, certainly of the Burn Synod would be, you have to go. You don't have to believe what the people are saying, but you got to go and keep quiet and be a good, keep your mouth shut and not be disruptive. And that would be an external kind of a thing. It wouldn't make any claims about whether you actually believe what's being preached or are being reached. And so this distinction that's at play in, say, Capito, Wolfgang Capito is the author, I think, of the Theses of the Bern Synod, is this distinction between external compliance, you could say, and internal belief. So they recognize and acknowledge you can't compel someone to actually believe, but you can compel them to behave and not be disruptive. And maybe the Spirit will move on them through the preaching of the Word and the worship service. That's partly the calculation too. I mean, you're putting them in the best position, even though they are recalcitrant and not believing in hypocrites and all that. You're putting them in the best objective position to be touched by the Spirit of God.
So I had to step out a moment, so I don't know if my question got already asked, but I hope not. So in Zurich, which went primarily with a magisterial form of discipline, one could imagine that Zwingli and the Reformers went along with this for pragmatic reasons. In other words, they would have preferred the other model. But they went with this one because they need to keep the magistrates on side. Is there any evidence from Zwingli's writings, letters, anywhere, to say that, he would prefer something else, but this is what we'll do for now because this is what we can get?
I don't know of that in Zwingli. It's very possible, and I would defer to people who know Zwingli better. I will just say there is some evidence for that in the case of Luther. Maybe the evidence for it are the kinds of statements that are reproduced in some of these Anabaptist literatures that, yes, I mean, they recognize this central dynamic, and in the best of all possible worlds, we wouldn't have to compel. And in fact, some of the confessional documents will say that it would be best if the Christian magistrate didn't have to exercise this kind of authority, and that's a possibility. I'm not willing to say it was merely a pragmatic bargain, because it does seem to be a principal difference, and there are exchanges between the Reformers in their letters and so on where they just disagree. Mm-hmm. And what's notable about that to me within say the Genevan-Zurich relationship is that they do have, for whatever reasons, a real disagreement about the relationship. But they're not willing to make that a point of breaking fellowship, right? So there's an acknowledgement that you do things differently in Zurich. That doesn't mean we think it's right. Mm-hmm. We acknowledge that you have diversity in some sense of the relationship, and these things can be ordered in different ways. That doesn't mean we think our way isn't the right way we do, but we're willing to have that not be a point over which we break fellowship or relationship in some sense.
So in that case, the example that would be a telling one is the example of Martin Butzer in Strasbourg, who has the magisterial discipline system kind of set up, but then also wants a voluntarist model where devout congregational people will actually join in a discipline that's done much more on a sort of consistorial kind of model.
And then you can see in his treatise in the English context, De Regno Christi, he's very explicit that the civil authorities have this same duty. That's kind of a consistent picture. So, depending on the context and depending on what they think is achievable, not that I'm accusing Butzer of being inconsistent, but they can emphasize different aspects of this. And I do think, I mean, these are zealous reformers. They want a pure church by whatever means is possible. Some of them are willing to accept corruptions in society and worldliness to maintain more of a kind of a coherent identity, social identity, while others, say Wasky or some of these others that are more emphasized on a pure church, are much more apt to make a sharper distinction, yes, maybe within a more unified understanding of society than totally apart from, but willing to make those kinds of subdivisions or subcategorizations. Yeah. Well, maybe he's going to tell us about Zwingli. I hope.
No,
okay.
I'm going to ask a question where I hope you can help me. Thank you for that, and the narrative that you're talking about, I think the grand narrative that you're rethinking that you've offered us here, for someone who has to go back and talk to undergraduates about the rise of toleration, could you say a little bit more about how your reworking helps us to think about this?
Yeah. I mean, I guess my first step is to try to help us understand why they would make these kinds of decisions, right? So it's so foreign to think, why can't you just let them believe what they want to believe, right? That was the expression, the sentiment expressed in one of yesterday's sessions. That's the common kind of fundamental attitude that we have nowadays. Well, I just don't understand. It doesn't make any sense. So trying to understand why they would have why reformers like Musculus would have held this kind of a view, I think, is absolutely important. And so that's why I try to I just said a little bit about this acknowledgement of the phenomenon of hypocrisy. In the 67 Articles, Zwingli says hypocrisy is the most despicable sin in God's eyes. And yet, I'm going to impose a form of church-state relationship that's going to basically foment hypocrisy. Right? So there's there's a calculus, or at least a kind of there's an analysis. There's something going on there where they're weighing the relative dangers and acknowledging that hypocrisy is a real danger and of vice and all these sorts of things, and saying, but we have to make some kind of a bargain, and we're going to prefer that to allowing people like Servetus or whoever to go around and just lead lay people astray and certainly they're going to upset the social order, and the civil magistrates are going to be very concerned about that. But they're more concerned about their people's eternal welfare, and that's really why. They think the teachings of these heretics are going to lead people into damnation. So it's out of that, it's out of love, right, that they're making these sorts of. So that doesn't mean we have to agree or whatever. You can't criticize maybe they're wrong about making that kind of a bargain. But I think the first step is really understanding what some of the dynamics are, and that it's not that they were ignorant, that they thought, oh, I can, use a sword to make you believe or something like that. No, they knew that was not going to, that wasn't what they were trying to accomplish.
This is Amy Burnett. Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. And I'm picking up on this, on Butzer's idea, what I think would be moving 50 years ahead into a completely different geographical area, the whole issue of the public church and the relationship with the magistrate in the Dutch Republic raises kind of interesting questions about, on the one hand, the church being able to exercise discipline over its own members, but at the same time having this whole group of Liefhebber who identify as Christians but not as members of the church, and what is the magistrate's responsibility there? That really complicates the picture tremendously.
Yeah. So this distinction we've already been talking about a little bit between this kind of Zurich model or the one-sphere model and the two-sphere model, or whatever terminology you want to use, already demonstrates there's a kind of diversity of approaches within this Corpus Christianum model. And these other concrete historical examples show there are many more other ways of arranging these two things within a broader understanding that is coherent with respect to the public role of religion and the civil authorities with respect to religion. So you could have an establishment without enforcement of uniformity. In many ways, it's analogous to say to the transition from Constantine to Theodosius, right? So it's one thing to make Christianity a legal phenomenon. It's another thing to privilege it in some way, and there's lots of different ways of doing that, of course, through regulation and other things. It's another thing to enforce that as the orthodoxy on everything, right? So these are just three basic approaches, and they have different shades of ways of trying to come to some sort of a livable compromise in the subsequent history. Many of which were still, I mean, these are all in many ways live examples today in different parts of Europe and the United States.
So I think one of the benefits of your example of Peter Martyr Vermigli is you do categorize him in the disciplinarist group, and yet you show how there's that variation, and you said there are various responses. I was wondering, in those kind of varied responses within the Reformed tradition, do you find that some of that is based on whether the Reformed community is within a context where they have most of sort of political support, or at least, a chance to kind of dominate the scene, so to speak?
Sure.
Or do they have kind of a different response when they really are the minority religion, when they are sort of, this persecuted minority, or that kind of thing? So, because I just wonder if the political context itself might sway people more toward one side or another, or have them make these sort of adjustments.
Yeah. So when Corinne asked earlier, I said I'm not willing to chalk it all up to pragmatic kind of judgments, but I think there's definitely elements of that, and they are greater or lesser impacts depending on the particular context. In general, you can see this kind of pattern, and it's acknowledged in some of these documents that the tendency is when you're on the margins, you're pleading for religious liberty, and then once you achieve supremacy, then Roger Williams makes this case in the United, this kind of observation in the context of America and so on. Then you want to impose a new orthodoxy or some, and that's just kind of human nature, or at least a consistent historical phenomenon. I do think that you have to be prudent about the kinds of arguments you're making, given your own context. I didn't look at the Gallican Confession, for example, to see what it says about the magistrate. I mean, it'd be interesting to look and see what some of these official documents within the territories that they didn't have really any, depending on the context, didn't have much hope of having somebody defend and protect and promote the true Reformed religion, for example, what kinds of arguments they would make. Another example of this, of course, is the Erastian view, so-called, where if you've got the state imposing a particular form, you don't have to have the majority of the populace with you. You just have to convince the king or whoever's in power or the council or whatever, right? So, we could say something about that with respect to the Remonstrants in the Netherlands, for example, who tended to have this kind of more Erastian view. So, yeah, I do think there are important contexts that relate to the way this is presented and shakes out in different contexts.
And on that note, let's thank our speaker. We'll now take a break until 10:15, and then we will start promptly.